Fellow at GCE-US. Please introduce yourself in the Zoom chat box with your name, organizational affiliation, and location from where you're joining us today. For today's event, we have captioning available in English, so to turn on captions, please select CC at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In the chat, we are sharing links and resources, inviting you to please join us in taking action to advance quality and inclusive education for all. For participants in the US and with networks colleagues in the US, please reach out today to urge your members of Congress to fully fund global education and reauthorize the READ Act. Once again, thank you for joining our meeting. We are really excited for today's session and have an incredible lineup of speakers, all experts in the intersection of climate change and education. The speaker presentations will be followed by a discussion and Q&A sessions, so please feel free to write any questions you have in the Zoom chat box, as we would like to keep this meeting as interactive as possible. The theme for today's meeting is climate change and education, and here is an overview of our theme. In the face of the escalating climate crisis, our focus on climate resilience and education for youth and children is more crucial than ever. Climate change poses significant threats to stability and accessibility of education systems globally. This theme underscores our commitment to exploring innovative solutions that address the intersection of climate challenges and education. By fostering resilience within educational frameworks, we aim to empower the youth and children of our global community, ensuring they receive quality education despite the adversities posed by a changing climate. So without further ado, we are delighted to welcome our first speaker for the day, Chloe Noel. Chloe Noel is the Climate Advisor for Global Development Policy at Save the Children. She has more than a decade of experience advocating for just and equitable climate solutions in low and middle income countries. Prior to working on climate issues, Chloe worked in the faith community as an advocate for human rights in development, fair trade policies, immigration reform, and children's environmental health. Chloe also did 2 years of AmeriCorps service as a bilingual environmental mentor and educator in an Oregon high school and wetland preserve. She has a master's degree in Latin American Studies from UT Austin and bachelor degrees in Environmental Studies and Hispanic Studies from Mills College. Wow, that's quite a bio, Chloe. We're so honored to welcome you to speak with us today. Chloe, over to you.
Great, thanks for having me. So excited to be here. I am going to, let's see, share my screen. All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
So children born today experience more wildfires, droughts, floods, crop failures, sea level rise, and heat waves than a child born in 1960 over their lifetime. And this leads to really negative impacts for children. Every year, children experience lost days. 40 million children lose out on education every year. And girls especially are more likely to lose out on education as an economic coping mechanism for their families. Families might marry their girls off at an early age. They might have them stay home and help with domestic work around the house, including carrying water for long distances and facing the possibility of assault along the way, or have to leave their homes and become domestic workers. In all cases, it leads them to a likelihood of more danger and a lack of opportunities throughout their lifetime. And 9 million girls live in one of the top 10 hotspots for child marriage and climate change. And children with disabilities also lose out on education if they cannot physically get to school, for instance, during times of flooding. and they're also more likely to be left out of adaptation planning or left behind during an emergency. And 1,000 children under age 5 die each day from diseases associated with inadequate water and sanitation and hygiene. I just want to quickly touch on a couple terms that are part of the solutions for climate change. One is mitigation, so that means reducing greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. That could be shifting away from fossil fuels. It can be protecting ecosystems, which can be natural carbon sinks. And it can also and also be protecting forests and reforestation. So we do some of this work in a very small scale. We make sure that communities have access to off-grid renewable energy and also support projects around tree planting with children, like Esther in this picture. And that also helps mitigate any kind of flooding during heavy rains and soil erosion. And then adaptation is another piece of that. And so that's for communities who are already starting to experience impacts of climate change so that they can prepare for any kind of extreme weather event, whether it's short or long-term, such as a long-term drought, and also to adapt to a future with resilient livelihoods, alternative livelihoods. So that's really important. And we participate in that kind of work through creating, using climate information, such as when extreme weather might hit and being able to act early and respond. We also support resilient fishing and farming techniques, as well as creating alternative livelihoods such as beekeeping. And then when it's not possible to adapt any longer, communities are experiencing already loss and damage. And in Pakistan in 2022, a third of the country went underwater, and we were there to respond with humanitarian support, making sure that children had safe places to stay and opportunities to learn and have access to psychosocial service, as well as water and food. And I demonstrated a few of the ways that we are supporting communities in their response to climate change. I'll touch on a couple education examples here. One we have is through the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We have a program that supports smallholder farmers to access markets for their crops, thus creating livelihoods for their families and also providing food for school feeding programs in the schools, as well as investing in resilient water and sanitation and hygiene projects there. We're also supporting a global campaign of youth called Generation Hope, including in Guatemala, where children are learning about climate change, acting locally, and also engaging on policy changes, whether that's at the local, national, or international level. And the children here are meeting with the Vice President-elect of Guatemala. We have a bigger project in Solomon Islands. We are accredited with the Green Climate Fund, which is the largest climate finance fund in the world. And in the case of this project, the Solomon Islands are the second highest risk of disasters, and around 2/3 of people live within a kilometer of the coast. So we're supporting locally led projects there that will incorporate climate curriculum into the schools and create youth jobs in incubators, as well as an app so that farmers can know if there's going to be a heavy rain or drought and be able to act very quickly with adaptation solutions. And then we have another big project that was just approved with the Global Partnership on the Environment, on Education. And it will be the largest climate and education project. And this is also with the Green Climate Fund. It's starting in 3 countries to make schools more resilient, do environmental education, and they'll expand that project after 3 years. So some of the solutions we see are making sure that social services are shock responsive to climate change, investing in climate finance for mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage. And we're particularly focused on the adaptation piece, and making sure that programs are child responsive, that they meet the needs of children, that children are engaged as active participants in the solution. So we are working to meet the US commitments to the global community on climate finance, including $3 billion for the adaptation, all of government effort called PREPARE, and the loss and damage commitment that they just made to the new loss and damage fund. We're also trying to build bipartisanship around global climate issues, especially impact children. So we have a congressional resolution that we're working on getting to both a Republican and Democrat sponsor for this, and then we'll we're using as a tool to do education around this issue. And then we're also supporting child participation in policy making. I'm going to try to show a video if I can. And if it doesn't work, then I'll just...
Moi particulièrement, je suis passionnée par les droits des enfants, plus précisément l'éducation de la jeune fille et également la lutte contre les mariages des enfants. Et je suis passionnée aussi pour la lutte contre le changement climatique dans mon pays. Dans mon pays, le constat est qu'il y a une insuffisance de pluviométrie et également un déficit d'eau, ce qui fait que les populations sont très pauvres parce que nous constatons que les effets néfastes du changement climatique fait que la jeune fille n'a pas le droit d'aller à l'école, alors elle ne participe pas au développement de son pays et elle est considérée comme étant le sexe faible et elle n'a pas sa place dans la société. Moi, je pense que c'est très important de laisser les enfants et les jeunes s'exprimer parce qu'ils sont les principaux concernés. Ils savent ce dont ils ont besoin, ce qu'ils vivent et ils sont très bien placés pour exprimer leurs besoins. Et lorsque les enfants s'expriment, le gouvernement pourrait mieux comprendre. Moi, je pense qu'il faut créer des espaces pour les jeunes, créer des groupes pour permettre aux jeunes de discuter et ensemble de faire entendre leur voix.
Chloe, you're on mute.
Thank you for that. So we are so lucky to have Anj and Kubra, another girl who represents her province in the parliament, child parliament in Nigeria, to speak with policymakers ahead of COP28 about the kind of solutions that they want to see. And that's an important part of our work too at Save the Children. All right, that's all I have. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for sharing your wonderful work with us. We're so happy to have you with us today. Next, we'd like to introduce Crispin Williams, Senior Advisor Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at Right to Play International. Crispin is a seasoned political influencer and advocacy expert who has covered areas such as Westminster, Brussels, the EU, and Geneva, the UN, for over 20 years. Cutting his teeth in embassies, multilateral organizations, and the UK Houses of Parliament, he has used this knowledge to influence policy across multiple sectors, most recently the development and education aid sector, as the Senior Advisor for Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at Right to Play. He holds a master's degree in political theory from the London School of Economics. Welcome, Crispin.
Well, thank you very much. And I didn't actually know I'd have such eminent colleagues alongside me, such as Raki, and obviously a colleague from Save the Children. So I will focus a little bit more specifically to the advocacy side, given that that's probably the strength area that I work from, given the policy background. And we've obviously had a bit of a broader thematic background from Save the Children and obviously Raki alongside from ECW will probably be giving more of a sort of broader picture as well. So perhaps it could be to sort of talk a bit more about some of these crossovers and areas that are coming up for 2024 and how they link in. I haven't prepared a presentation, so you have to deal with me talking for five or so minutes, but then I'm sure we'll go into other things. So as the bio alluded to there, I work for an organization called Right to Play, but I'm heavily involved in the climate area through such as a CSO group that links into ECW that I've engaged with Raki on, and just to the fact that climate and education is becoming arguably a priority focus, if not the priority focus, given the rising importance of climate, and also education's importance as an aid to climate solutions, and the fact that currently we are not getting enough focus in that area nor funding. So that is something that we are all very focused on, and myself in particular, given that sort of background on how we can take best practice to actually start influencing people. And when I say people, I'm talking more about outside of our traditional stakeholders, the ministries of education and some of the larger multilateral actors, to the likes of the ministries of finance and obviously world banks and people like that, who haven't engaged perhaps so much with the sector and who we need to work more strongly to put our point across. And perhaps you could put the theme as sort of breaking out of silos and looking to do more collaboration. I think that perhaps as a sector, we have been too focused on doing business as usual going forward and making the case for our programs and feeling that that is enough. But over time, there has been a downturn in funding to the education sector. That's at pretty much every national level now, and at multilateral level as well. So something's not been working in terms of how we're making our case to decision makers on the importance of education. And I think that, going back to one of the points that was mentioned in the previous presentation around COP28, that was the first time that education had been given a priority in the sort of strategic strands of COP. And that was at the behest and strong push of Dubai as its presidency. And we want to continue to make sure that that is the case moving forward. But just to re-emphasize that that was a bit of a groundbreaking moment in terms of the sector coming together and galvanizing behind these messages, although it was talked about from the wider side as a sort of transition from fossil fuels. I think in terms of a just transition for children, whether education and more broadly, there's still quite a lot to be done in terms of active participation in the process and things, moving forward in terms of making sure that their voice is essential in driving the climate agenda. Just looking ahead, perhaps to focus on some of the issues I think are going to be playing a large role this year, that perhaps both wearing my GCE board hat, as I've just joined you now as the ENACE board rep, the Europe and North America Campaign for Education board rep, and we have our board meeting next week in Cape Town, and we will be discussing climate as one of the issues of importance there, and I will be making the case of how we need to continue and to collaborate across with other organizations, such as the likes of Education Cannot Wait and some of the others. But some of the big things that are coming up this year that I think are going to be very important that we start to really focus on and think, how are we going to make the case to the decision makers on some of these points? So the first one I might start with is the Summit of the Future. Now, this sort of builds off of things like Transforming Education Summit before. It's the sort of next step, and many people are seeing it as the precursor to the new SDGs, really, in a way of setting the framework. Now, there's a number of chapters and chapter titles, but there are roots linking to youth, but there's nothing, again, directly in terms of education and how we are to make that point. And I think that this will be a first good test of the sort of cross-sector collaboration I feel is needed here to really make the case. And what I mean by that is, obviously, we have Global Campaign for Education as we sit here. We have the Global Partnership for Education. We have the Greening Education Partnership. We have ECW. How can we come together, especially as the civil society side, the INGOs, the the national NGOs and youth, all the different sides, to come behind some key recommendations to actually, make a difference in terms of getting education listed and involved in both the narrative and the thinking around this? Because especially if this is going to be moving forward, I suspect that there's going to be a lot on climate in it, but to make sure that education is seen as part of the solution and not typically, as it has traditionally been seen, as a sort of next step. Let's get the key things done. If it's sort of education emergencies, we'll focus on what the priorities are, and then we'll come to education, for example. It's that this is something from the beginning that you need to build in, and this will strengthen any response. So I think that that's going to be a key side. I know they've already had their draft zero, which I think is closed now, but there'll be opportunities to feed into that process, and both through GCE and together with other partners. And I'll be having a number of these discussions with the likes of ECW and other organizations, how we set ourselves behind this to really move forward and support the wider push to make sure that education is kept at the top. Also, I wanted to talk a bit about COP29 coming up. It's going to be Azerbaijan this year. Again, as I mentioned, it was the sort of behest of Dubai that education was kept top of the agenda. So we need to work to make sure that it remains that way. How do we do that? I think that there's going to be a meeting in July or June perhaps. I think it's June, of the UNFCCC in terms of what comes next at the COP in Azerbaijan. And again, what can we come together as a sector in terms of making the case and making the recommendations the way we want education to be portrayed, and to have a role in the way that young people and their voice can be at the center of that as well. So, these are some of the key points that I think that really together as a sector, and, there's all the different sides, but I think both the sort of traditional humanitarian, the sort of development side, how we all come together to make that case. These are going to be two real sort of test beds to show us how we can do that. And again, these are things that as GCE we can be active in and take a role and work with our other large organization partners. I think another thing I wanted to mention as well, and this is something going in the loop, it's not sort of confidential, but it's not sort of been commonly expressed so far, is how do we standardize our language, our processes, all the aspects, because it's not just about making the case for our advocacy, it's that we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, we're all using the same language, we're all making the same sort of points so people understand when they're thinking about education, what is it that people mean. And there's a number of initiatives going around. I know the Greening Education Partnership are sort of looking at how we can standardize this language and the focus points, whether it's around anticipatory action or other things in the climate area. And that again is something that I think is quite important. I think there is a gap between the humanitarian and the sort of development side, and how we talk and express things in relation to climate education that only hinders us. So I think this sort of standardization piece, and how again all of our organization can be part of that, can share in that development and that process, so that we're all adapting at the same pace. Because I think many of us are still trying to work out how do we adapt our programs and projects to climate moving forward. So that's the second point that I would make. And then the third point I'd make is again talking about what I personally take from having worked outside of the sector. I'm relatively new to the aid and development and humanitarian sector, but having taken experience from across other sectors, what can we do to galvanize our offer from the sector? Because the big concern that I sometimes have, obviously, yes, it's aid, it sort of goes with that point, but we need to be offering something rather than asking. We can't keep saying, just give us more funding or we need more help. How are we helping the situation? What are we doing for, the finance minister of a certain country or someone else to actually improve the problems that they are facing? And I think that these are some of the things we need to think about. What is it that we're actually saying about education now that we've come together as a sector and we see it as important? What are the sort of points we're making to say this is why we can benefit in the solutions around climate in other areas like that? So I'll keep it to that, because I know that we're sort of limited for time and we've got other speakers and we'll have questions, but I think it really is to sort of break out of the silos and work together in collaboration. As I say, I have a number of different hats on, but sitting with my GCE board hat on, I really want your views and your thoughts about, how the Secretariat and board can work better to support what you do as organizations, and how we can collaborate cross-sector with the likes of GPE and ECW to make sure that we make that case for education, because these are crucial decisions that are happening in the next few years. And if we're not part of it now, then it really might impact us for the next 5-10 years in difficulty. So it's about taking a positive step forward. And I hope I can do that together with you all. And just to say thank you so much for the time to speak today.
Thank you so much, Crispin, for your wonderful insights and for joining us today. Next, we'd like to introduce Anjan Andrea Morsada, Advocacy and Communication Manager at Humanity and Inclusion. With a background in social sciences, Anjan's career has predominantly focused on communications and public relations. He has been a part of the Handicap International within Madagascar program for the past 3 years, serving as Advocacy and Communication Manager. In this role, he, along with his team, worked tirelessly to advocate and raise awareness, ensuring inclusivity across various sectors, including health rights and particularly education. Welcome, Anjan.
Yeah, hello everyone. Okay, you are going to.
Anjan, you're on mute, sorry.
Okay, it's good. Yes, so I said good morning everyone and good evening to those in the same time zone as us. Today I'm thrilled to present you a report that we undertook in 2023. Next slide, please. Yes, so the report is titled Always Included in Uninterrupted Education for Children with Disabilities Before, During, and After a Crisis. Next slide, please. The report illustrates how education systems need to become more disability inclusive and more resilient to cope with crisis. It explores the continuity of learning, teaching, and financing. It calls on stakeholders to ensure access to education for children with disabilities without any interruption before, during, and after a crisis, and to ensure that the report is of quality and inclusive. So it is informed by testimonies, key data, and solid arguments, as well as consideration from key informants interviews, such as teachers, school principals, United Nations agencies, donors, families, and of course, pupils and students themselves. So the project case, it shows project case from 3 countries. Next slide, please. So the study was carried out in 3 countries with different socio-economic contexts, including Burkina Faso, the occupied Palestinian territory, and Madagascar, where consultations were held in the eastern region of the islands. As you may have guessed, my presentation will be more focused on the case of Madagascar, addressing the impact of the climate crisis on education, especially concerning students with disabilities. Next slide, please. Globally, some 72 million of children are out of school because of emergencies and protracted crises. Of these, 70% are children with disabilities, and especially in Madagascar, flood and cyclones have devastating effects on teaching continuity, destroying learning materials and infrastructure. Children and youth with disabilities face significant obstacles to access and thrive in education. Obstacles are exacerbated when multiple and overlapping crises occurs, such as the proliferation of violent, often protracted conflicts, the climate crisis, and disease outbreaks. Securing uninterrupted access to inclusive education in all circumstances and before, during, and after crisis is essential for empowering these children in enhancing their ability to participate meaningfully in society and their future employability. Yeah. Next slide, please. Throughout the report, we emphasize the importance of continuing learning, continuing and teaching, and continuing financing education. On the right slide, you can see a picture of a typical classroom filled with boys and girls, both with and without disabilities in the eastern regions of Madagascar. And this snapshot captures the students striving to attend classes just hours before the cyclone breakthrough. Next slide, please. Generally speaking, climate crises have a significant impact on education. Examples of common damages include the destruction and inaccessibility for infrastructure such as roads, transportation services, and hospitals. And additionally, boys and girls with disabilities are particularly affected by the loss of wheelchairs, of hearing aids, and making them vulnerable to multiple forms of exclusion and injuries. Yes, next please. So you can directly go to the next slide because there are maybe some, yeah. Thank you. So here are the main key messages regarding continuing learning. When school closures are unavoidable, many steps can be taken to limit their disruptive effect and ensure the return to school of all children as soon as possible. The risk that a child will experience learning disruption during a crisis are magnified when multiple factors of discrimination intersect, such as gender, disability, age, socioeconomic, and migratory status. Next, please. In Madagascar, the BHAZU, Right to Education for All project, set up in Madagascar in 2015 and funded by the French Development Agency, AFD. Next, yeah. And to implement innovative action to support vulnerable boys and girls. Yes, thank you. Building on this prior experience and the second project towards universal access of vulnerable girls and boys to quality primary education, funded by the Educate a Child Foundation, we introduced a number of innovations and implemented the bridging principle. And we continue to implement this principle through our recent inclusive education project. So how does it work? Teachers receive the training on the basic of inclusive education so that they could better adapt their teaching methods to each child's particular circumstances and needs. Next, as said earlier, the report promotes continuing teaching in crisis-prone settings in order to assure a quality, inclusive education. The fact is, teachers must overcome enormous obstacles, including damaged facilities, insufficient teaching materials, intermittent school closures, and adapt to remote and hybrid classes. Next, please. Teacher shortages continue to hamper progress towards the achievement. Yeah, that one. Yeah, towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 4. And financial strain during crisis often disrupts the payment of teacher salaries, impacting their motivation and retention. And next slide. So therefore, there are main key messages regarding continuing teachings. One of, on the one hand, teachers should be trained, equipped, and prepared to teach inclusively under changing and challenging circumstances. On the other hand, they should be provided with good working conditions and support for their mental health and well-being. Fourth, distance learning modalities offer great potential for maintaining education continuity in crisis. However, they are often not accessible and not affordable. And finally, inclusive disaster risk reduction plans must consider the needs of all students and staff, including persons with disabilities. So schools communities play a pivotal role in connecting students and families with support services, activating referral pathways, and even providing temporary shelter. Sorry. Next. Yeah, so next, please. Okay, so since 2017, the Care Madagascar and Humanity Inclusion Consortium has implemented free inclusive risk and the disaster management projects to enhance the preparedness and response capacities of population affected by natural disasters. One of these interventions, known as MIAR project, financed by the European Union Directorate, develop the capacity of students and school communities in inclusive DRR. Next, please. So continuing financing is one of the pillars of addressing uninterrupted education. So I have 1 minute left, and maybe I will shorten some slides and go to the last one, please. Another one. Next. Yeah, because all things that I said was already covers. Okay, yeah, thank you. So what do we recommend? First, next, please. First, enhance collaboration across sectors, including education, health and rehabilitation, nutrition and shelter and protection. Second, increase the volume of funding for education. And last, next please, ensure that flexibility and coherence guide humanitarian and development efforts. And that brings me to the end of my presentation normally. Yeah, so Maya, thank you for being such an attentive audience. And please feel free to consult and share the full report. I will drop the link in the chat box. Thank you.
Anjan, thank you so much for your presentation today. Now we would like to introduce our next speaker, Rocky Williams from Education Cannot Wait. Rocky Williams is Chief of Strategy, Planning and Accountability at the Education Cannot Wait, the Global Fund for Education in Emergencies and Protracted Crises. Rocky is responsible for ensuring successful implementation of ECW's strategic plan of 2023 to 2026, which seeks to reach 20 million children and adolescents with quality and inclusive education. She leads ECW's work on risks, safeguarding, and climate, one of the boldest new areas in this strategic plan. In addition to overseeing the Acceleration Facility, ECW's flagship $40 million investment window, which supports global public goods and innovation within the education emergencies PC sector. Prior to joining ECW in 2022, Rocky spent a decade working for the UK government's Department for International Development, now known as FCDO, in various roles, including as the DFID representative in Somalia, acting deputy head of office in Nigeria, head of humanitarian, peacebuilding UN funds and programs, and deputy head of COP26 delivery. In her early career, she worked at the Social Mobility Foundation, supporting the educational aspirations of adolescents from the poorest UK households, and sat on the board of Y Care International, the YMCA's youth-focused development agency. Welcome, Rocky, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Really lovely to be here, and in community with such inspiring colleagues working on climate and education from various different angles. And it's actually, yeah, I have a warm feeling in terms of what we're achieving as a sector, even though, as we've seen, there's so much more to go. So today, I really just wanted to share ECW's vision for what we're doing to address the climate crisis in our own way, and also to share some takeaways from COP28. So to start, next slide, please. I just wanted to set out what are the commitments that we've made publicly in terms of our approach on climate. And as you can see, there are 7 broad commitments, and they really fall into 3 areas: programming, policy, and operational. And I'll touch on a few of these later in the presentation, but perhaps I can start by zoning in on programming. And there I really want to just highlight the role of the Comprehensive School Safety Framework, the CSSF, in being a guiding star, a blueprint for our sector. And for colleagues who aren't so familiar with the CSSF, it's produced by GADRES, so the Global Alliance for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience in the Education Sector, of which we're a member. And it really is incredibly helpful as a guide to think about what does best practice programming look like. And it includes 3 core pillars. So there's a focus on safer learning facilities, education continuity, and risk reduction and resilience. Some of the themes that I think came out very well in Anjan's presentation just now. And the other angle on this slide that maybe I can just quickly touch on is the final point, which is really about getting our own ECW house in order and greening our own footprint. We're a hosted fund of UNICEF, so we do follow UNICEF's policies, and they've actually put out quite a bold commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030. And we already offset our travel, but there's many steps we can take, but definitely that's something that we want to also turn to, as well as working with partners to ask them to do work. We want to also turn to ourselves. So let's turn to the next slide, and I can talk a little bit more about our programming. So as part of our new approach last year, we conducted the first baseline of our climate programming, and we really wanted to learn how much of ECW programming, of which we've had over $1 billion in funding to date, how much of that could be considered climate related. And what we found is that it exceeded 250 million, almost 400 million. So approximately 25 to 40% of our programming, without necessarily having a climate strategy, already was climate related, just because of what we're seeing in the very vulnerable, often conflict affected context that we work in. And there's two types of programming there, all of which would be considered adaptation. But the first type is what you're seeing on the screen. So it's responding here to climate disasters, such as cyclones in Madagascar or Mozambique, or floods in Pakistan. In Pakistan, there were, the devastating floods caused, I think it was 27,000 schools to be damaged or destroyed, 27,000, which is a staggering number. But at the same time, you have, as we all know, continuing complications of drought in the Horn of Africa, and East Africa. So all of that falls under our approach to climate emergencies, and we know that we spent 40 million to date on that. And I think one thing there, as we've seen from the presentations, it's about building back better. It's about physical infrastructure. It's about continuity of education. I think one thing that's also really important in these contexts is psychosocial support. And there's a quote that I often turn to from a student called Nela in Malawi, who was a student who benefited from ECW funded programs following Cyclone Idai. And she said, when a disaster strikes, learning suffers as our minds switch to things we lost and the immediate problems we go through. And I think that really shows the point that it's not just about physical building back and continuity, but it's also really ensuring a holistic approach to when you're working with learners in the wake of a climate disaster. And that's very much the tagline of ECW's work, a holistic, inclusive approach to education. So let me now turn to COP28. I think there's a next slide, please. So yeah, this is also, I won't touch on DRR, but this slide just shows that we've done a lot on DRR, and it remains around 25% of our portfolio. Next slide, please. Thank you. So ECW has become known for producing what we call our global estimate study. So this is an estimate of, well, let me share that right now, 224 million children and adolescents, crisis-affected children and adolescents, are in need of urgent educational support, 224 million. So that's the global estimate that we produce and update each year. And the chair of our board, Gordon Brown, who's also the UN envoy for education, has been challenging us repeatedly, yes, but how many of those children are climate affected? And last year we were able to answer that and do some intensive data and research to identify that actually that figure is 62. So about a third of those children in need of emergent educational support have been impacted by climate hazards since 2020. And we also know that 13 million displacements have happened of school-aged children as a result of extreme weather events. And we also identified that, I think as is known, that droughts are the most frequently experienced climate shock, closely followed by floods. And finally, that research, which is titled Futures at Risk, please do look it up, highlighted that the most disruptive effects are experienced by girls and children on the move, displaced populations. We didn't have the statistics for children living with disabilities, but I'm sure as well, I think from our work more generally, we know that they are also a particularly vulnerable group who need a certain adjustments and working with teachers and communities in order to reach the most marginalized. So that was the research, really, that was the beginning of our COP28 journey. And what we did with that research, next slide, please, is that we produced an appeal where we were saying that there's this huge need, and we are asking for funding in order to address it, to meet the needs of children at the front line, particularly girls, particularly displaced children and adolescents. So we asked for $150 million in order to reach 2 million children. And the appeal is still live. It's going to go until COP29, and it's called Right Here, Right Now. And really the the reason I had a really enjoyable experience brainstorming with colleagues trying to work out what is the name of this big appeal we're going to launch. And we landed on Right Here, Right Now, because we felt that there's a lot of discussion about climate and education. And there's a lot of very healthy discussion saying, yes, climate needs to be in curriculums. We need to empower young people as agents of change, which is a very necessary activity. But we felt that perhaps the global discussion has overlooked the needs of children right here, right now, who are at the front line of the climate crisis. The learners that we saw in the presentation from Anja, and also, the work that we're seeing from other colleagues such as SAVE and their programming. So that was the genesis. Next slide, please. And we took that appeal to COP28 and really tried to raise the alarm and put a spotlight on education in emergencies within wider dialogues on climate and education. So our Executive Director, Yasmin Sarif, top left, spoke, for example, at the Reward Summit on Education Day. We had wonderful endorsements of our appeal from the Minister of Education, Minister Deng from South Sudan, and we had Denmark give us our first ever climate-specific contribution. So we're very, very thankful to Denmark for their leadership. And it was an interesting experience, and maybe I can share here just some threads that I saw coming out of COP28, and I think Crispin also talked about some of this. So I think firstly, the climate relief, recovery and peace declaration. So broadly, climate and conflict, that was definitely a theme that came out. For the first time, there was this declaration, and really hats off to the UAE for enabling that. There was a declaration that came out and said that the climate community needs to do adaptation in a more intensive way in conflict-affected areas, because they are more vulnerable and there are multi-dimensional challenges that play out in a very specific way. And you need to have humanitarians working with development actors and climate actors and peace actors. So that was a landmark declaration that I think really broke the ice on this intersection that many of us have long talked about. And interestingly, Chloe earlier mentioned that the Green Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund, who are aiming to raise 50 billion by 2030, their CEO spoke really powerfully at COP about the need that they needed to really shake up their approach and work more intensely in those types of conflict, in those types of contexts, climate-affected contexts, where they haven't necessarily been focusing, where it might be harder, where they need to reach those furthest left behind. So that's a really interesting thread that I think we'll see further with GCF. So definitely climate and conflict in that intersection is something to watch. And then the second angle is really climate and the humanitarian sector. So on the slide, you'll see getting ahead of disasters. This was the charter that was launched at COP that we very proudly signed up to. It's a charter on finance. So as a fund, we've signed up publicly and said we will put finance aside to act ahead of climate disasters, because we all know that's more effective than acting afterwards. So that charter was led by REAP, the Risk Informed Early Action Partnership, and is something that we will be doing this year. And I think related to acting early, there was a lot of discussion, obviously, on the Loss and Damage Fund and the fact that that's now created, which is a huge coup. And it's, there's already work happening. I think the humanitarian sector has been working on loss and damage effectively for years, just in a different way. And there's very interesting actors. And I remember hearing OCHA, for example, talk at COP about how they can already quantify how much they've been spending on work that's not only saved lives, but has also responded to resultant losses and damages. So there's a lot of learning that can be taken from the humanitarian sector and applied to future loss and damage funded work. So I'd like to finish just really talking about what's next for ECW, looking beyond COP28. Next slide, please. So we have many priorities this year and those 7 commitments, but I think if I had to zone in on our top 3 for this year, it's our work on anticipatory action. It's funding through the acceleration facility and really going bigger and bolder with our climate appeal. So let me just touch on those very briefly before I finish. So in terms of, next slide, please, in terms of anticipatory action, sorry, in terms of programming, of which anticipatory action is a part, I think our anticipatory action pilots are going to be really exciting this year. We've committed to doing 2, using partly the money that's come in from Denmark, specifically for climate. And we're identifying the countries right now. We're trying to think about what criteria would we use to pilot those interventions. But effectively, the idea there is about agreeing with a partner country agreeing with partners, for example, NGO partners, and putting in place and agreeing triggers that would be used to activate a response. So, for example, if certain conditions or weather-related climatic conditions were met in certain regions and you expected, a sudden onset flood event, these are the things and activities you would do in order to maybe support, communities on the move and establish temporary learning shelters or temporary learning spaces even. So that work is quite complicated and in depth, but that's what we'll be doing and focusing on with the aim of launching 2 pilots this year. And it's again delivering on our commitment to act early. And then in terms of other kind of programming highlights, I think the main one that's I think particularly also interesting is the work that we'll be doing on environmental impact assessments, working with our partners to really understand how can they reduce the negative impact of their projects that they might have on the natural environment. And also just tracking. We're building new climate indicators so we can really measure and track our effectiveness on this. And as part of now having an earmarked pot, so donors can give us climate-specific money for our climate work, we'll be using the OECD DAC RIO markers, which are, I think, a good standard for the sector to code our work so that we know what are our climate-related interventions. And then next slide, please. The Acceleration Facility. This is a fund that I oversee that's really about building global goods for the sector and supporting innovation. So there's 2 areas there. We're going to be launching at some point a $1 million grant to an organization either working on climate or education who can join the dots and do some innovative work at the intersection of climate and the education and emergency sector. And we're running a semi-competitive exercise and we've reached out to organizations and we're receiving bids right now. And then we'll also be doing some specific financing on a few areas that are listed on the screen. So guidance, for example, we realize there's a lot of good guidance out there on green. How can you green a school? How can you build a school in a green way, in an environmentally friendly way? But similar to what I was saying about education emergencies being left out, there's not really much guidance out there on how you can construct temporary learning spaces in a green and environmentally efficient way. So we want to use our fund to fill that gap and support a process that leads to the creation of guidance that will be useful for the sector. Next slide, please. And then finally, it's all about comms and advocacy and continuing our campaign. There, I think there's angles such as the Global Goal on Adaptation. It didn't include education, but there are definitely opportunities, for example, the Adaptation Forum in March to continue pressing for this importance of considering education within the wider adaptation agenda. And I think, as Crispin mentioned, in June in Bonn, there's a 60th meeting of the subsidiary bodies that meet ahead of a COP. And what's important about the one this year is that a decision was made at COP28 to have an expert dialogue on child rights and climate change that will happen in Bonn. So it's really important, I think, that the education sector is part of that dialogue and can really press for the need to highlight education as part of protecting the rights of all children. And finally, we are in the process of trying to identify a suitable youth climate champion to really be the face and support the advocacy work that we're trying to achieve with our Right Here, Right Now agenda. Next slide, please. I think this final slide really just says or suggests how we might seek your collaboration as a community. So really continue, I think, to include education emergencies and protracted crises in the way you engage on climate and education. Don't forget about that subset of stakeholders. Do share our appeal. Please help us achieve our 150 million target. And if you have ideas on a global youth climate champion who would be a good fit for ECW, please do reach out to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for presenting, Rocky. We admire all of the amazing work that you have done in climate education and to support children in need. Now we would like to give the floor to Faluyenka Fakoya from the Global Partnership for Education team. Faluyenka has joined GPE's Global Education team from the International Center for Research on Women, the ICRW, where she supported the Gender, Economic Empowerment, and Livelihoods portfolio. Prior to both roles, she worked as a consultant for the World Bank Poverty Global Practice on enterprises in Tanzania and for Jesuit Refugee Service on gender-responsive education programming. Polyuyenka was also a program officer at the Education Partnership TEP Center in Nigeria, where she supported the scaling up of innovative education interventions and has taught at a public secondary school in Kaduna, Nigeria. She has experience managing diverse partnerships and has worked with, among others, the Ministry of Community Development and Social Services of Zambia, the Federal Ministry of Education of Nigeria, and the MacArthur Foundation and the Brookings Institution. Polyuyenka has earned a master's in global human development from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and a BA in economics and sociology from Amherst College. Welcome, Polyuyenka. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Kate. And I hope you can all hear me. And so wonderful to be here with all of you and to really hear about all the amazing work that's going on and kind of hear what the reflections are following some of these key moments for climate and education that we've seen in the last few months. So as Kate mentioned, I'm an advocacy specialist with GPE, and we are a partnership and fund that's focused on providing quality education to children in lower income countries. We have 90 partner countries, and we work primarily through ministries of education, through country-led partnership compacts. And, you know, we've seen climate change and adaptation already as part of our core work through our work with ECW and other partners. About 1/3 of our grants currently have a climate resilience component. For example, in Lao PDR, GP is working with the government to incorporate climate resilient design measures into early learning facilities, which includes improving drainage for floods and also planting trees for preventing erosion. And for example, also Mozambique, after cyclones Idai and Kenneth, received $20 million from GPE, which reached 2.1 million students and really helped to build resilient infrastructure following those climate events. So now I'll just be talking a little bit more about what we're working on currently and some of our focus around climate smart education systems. And we know, we've heard from partners that, you know, these are really powerful tools in mitigation and adaptation efforts. And we've heard from our country partners, there's been a specific demand to make education systems climate smart. And so we're working with them and thinking about how we can do to sort of hone our focus in that area. And our objectives here are really about placing education on the long-term policy agenda. That's on climate and financing, and really surfacing the role of education as a key pillar of climate action, and also supporting our partner countries with technical assistance, financing, and also with coordination. And so, as we all know, to really move the needle, the first thing we need is political will. We've heard, especially from Rocky, about some of the different declarations to really sort of galvanize political commitment. And one thing that we're really happy to share is the groundbreaking declaration on the Common Agenda for Education and Climate Change that was launched at COP28 and has been adopted by 42 countries, including Brazil, who is the host of COP30 and the current host of the G20, and also the UAE, obviously as the host of COP28. And this is really a critical link between education and climate action that's being acknowledged at the global political level. It demonstrates significant political leadership, and it really sets the stage for three things. The first is increasing the commitments from countries to integrate education into their national climate strategies. Also making education strategies more climate smart, and thirdly, encouraging finance to create systems and students that are really climate ready. The second piece are some specific initiatives that we are working with partners on that will prepare the next generation to really understand, adapt, and innovate in a world that is increasingly shaped by climate change through the Climate Smart Education Systems Initiative and BRACE, which I'll go into a little bit more in the next few slides. We're really working to strengthen the capacity of country partners to integrate education, to integrate climate change into education sector plans, budgets, and strategies. And these two initiatives cover a wide range of activities. On the knowledge piece, again, working with partners, specifically with SAVE, to produce a report on the need for climate smart education financing, which really looks at the evidence base on the cost of different climate smart investments in education and also their benefits. So it's really a great resource to support decision making when it comes to investing in climate smart education. And of course, the comms piece is really important as well. So in collaboration with UNICEF Mozambique, we have a virtual reality video that's really immersive and focuses on Mozambique, looking at the impact of Cyclone Freddy in March 2023. And you see the personal story specifically from Maganja da Costa in Mozambique, which shows firsthand the efforts to rebuild communities and the impact of the cyclone on the inhabitants and on the people, specifically children in that village. And it's from the point of view of a young girl, again, bringing in that gender equality angle as well. And this is something that we most recently deployed at the AU Summit, where I was the last few days. And we had, the AU Commissioner for Education, ministers, and even some of the delegation from Mozambique participating and really speaking about the impact it had on them to really sort of have firsthand feel or firsthand experience of these efforts to rebuild communities. So this just kind of shows, our work to advocate to build political will and supporting that with technical capacity. So I'll go a little more in depth into a couple of the initiatives I mentioned. The first is our Climate Smart Education Systems Initiative, and the second is our initiative with the Green Climate Fund, which is called Building the Climate Resilience of Children and Communities Through the Education Sector, known as BRACE, which is a lot shorter and easier to pronounce. And so these two initiatives are really focused on building the capacity of the education sectors in different countries to respond to the climate crisis. They're two different programs, but they're aligned and really complementary. Again, looking at mainstreaming climate change adaptation and environmental sustainability in the education sector, also mobilizing climate finance and also fostering collaboration really at all levels to really kind of develop the enabling environment for resilience building of children and the education sector. And specifically looking at the BRACE initiative, I mean, these are really important initiatives because we know that only 2.4% of climate financing is specifically responding to children's needs. And within that, education projects are really negligible. So these are really great initiatives to start to look at how we can mobilize additional financing to respond to some of these issues. So the CSESI initiative is currently being piloted in Zimbabwe and Malawi, and you can see a little bit of the timeline there in some of the other countries that are eligible for this funding. This is through the GP multiplier, and we're doing this in partnership with Save the Children, UNESCO IEP, and UNESCO. And the BRACE project is currently being piloted in South Sudan, Cambodia, and Tonga, and I believe Chloe mentioned it as well. And there will be about 20 more countries that will be supported to access climate finance for regional and global activities. And this is done in partnership with SAVE, who are an accredited GCF entity, and at the same time, an accredited GPE grant agent. So in collaboration with GCF, UNESCO IEP, and UNESCO, this project will leverage $70 million to start. And has three different components. So apart from the pilots, there's also a focus on information and access to finance, so increasing the capacity of specifically ministries of education to access additional financing to build more climate smart education systems and to respond to climate change events and to increase resilience. And there's also a focus on coordination and learning, bringing education and climate stakeholders together to really kind of globally coordinate and share learnings and information. And the first meeting of that sort of the first inaugural meeting of that group was held at COP28. And so the BRACE pilots will directly reach about 4 million children and young people over the next 5 years. And again, this is the first phase of this partnership. And speaking of partnership, just want to touch a little bit on our work with young people, who are some of our most energetic and really our most important partners, especially when we look at our advocacy. And so working with GPA youth leaders, we have a small group of about 40 youth leaders. They're amazing young people working on different projects at the intersection of climate and education. And so we're working with them to amplify their work, amplify their voices, and also, really create opportunities for youth-led advocacy interventions and moments. So just a smattering of what we've had over the year. We've had Temilade at the spring meetings, where she shared her work in Nigeria in schools and with her organization at the launch of the Climate Smart Education Systems Framework. We also had youth leaders from Rwanda and Cambodia at the ECOSOC Youth Forum in 2023, where we held a side event with Gen U, with UNICEF's Gen U, on education and skills building for a sustainable future. And our young people shared the work that they're doing. For example, Wote in Cambodia, working with young girls to build, to create eco-friendly period products. And most recently in COP28, where we supported the participation of Valentine from Kenya and Salha from Tanzania, who are working on climate smart agriculture projects, and especially for young mothers who are trying to return back into the education system. So we really want, our work with young people is also focused on recognizing and amplifying the great work that they're doing and supporting them with their advocacy, be it in person, such as with these two events, or also virtually, including our annual Futures Festival that's led by our young leaders, and also their participation in several other virtual events and webinars and so on. And just to quickly round off, talking about a few next steps. So, I mean, I've had colleagues have mentioned the importance of some key moments coming up this year, including Summit of the Future and COP29. And so we're looking at these as key moments to continue building that political momentum, building that political will to commit to investing more in climate smart education systems, and also leveraging more financing for these systems as well, and continuing to work with partners and young people to really kind of push that forward, and really looking at how we can make education sort of a mainstay in these discussions, so that when we're thinking about climate action and mitigation and adaptation, we're automatically thinking about, the importance of ensuring access to education in order to achieve those goals. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Folyanka, for all your work in global education and amplifying youth voices. Next, we would like to introduce Amanda Bennett. Amanda Bennett is the program manager of the youth program at the ECI Secretariat and the Center for Education for Sustainable Development at UPeace, and a member of the UNESCO SDG4 Youth and Student Network. She was born in Guanacaste, Costa Rica, and grew up in South Carolina, United States. She earned a Bachelor of Arts in Experimental Psychology at the University of South Carolina and a Master's in Public Policy at the University of Maryland. While studying in Maryland, Amanda interned at the National Center for Healthy Housing and the funded Dollar Bill Project. After graduating, she moved back to Costa Rica and taught English in San Jose and briefly in Cusco, Peru. Amanda is currently pursuing a master's degree in environment, development, and peace at the University for Peace. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. And I really appreciate the invitation to join this meeting. I hope I will be able to join future ones because I have learned so much today and received so much inspiration. So I'm going to present some slides. So as you know, I am here. Oh, sorry. I am here as the program manager for the Earth Charter International Youth Program. So I will tell you a bit about our online youth courses. And also, although I'm 32, I have been quite involved as one of these young leaders. For example, I'm part of the SDG4 Youth Network. And in Costa Rica, locally, nationally, I'm part of the network for climate change, youth and climate change. So I have been around these young people, I have been listening to what we're saying, especially on a global scale. And I have just been so inspired by their work and everything that we need to do and everything that we're doing to get our story across. So If you have never heard of the Earth Charter, I'm not going to go through the entire timeline, but I did want to mention briefly some key points of our history for why this document can be used in education, especially because, so we can go back to 1987. There was this report from the United Nations called the Brundtland Report after Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was in charge of this commission. But really the name about the report is Our Common Future, because that's what we have, one common destiny, one common future as a human, as a planet. And this report is the one that called for a charter that brought together values and principles for sustainability. So people involved in the sustainability in the environment and development world met in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit for the UN. So all these countries came together and people said, hey, what about that charter? We need to get working on that. So it didn't happen at the summit. The Rio Declaration did come out though. So those people who were working on this declaration, who were showing up at these Earth Summits, so world leaders, civil society, educators, women, groups representing children, even some young people were there. They gathered and there was this big consultation process that ended up being a civil society movement. And it resulted in the Earth Charter that we have today. So you can read it on the website at earthcharter.org. You can go through the 4 different pillars. So the 4 different pillars of this document include respect and care for the community of life, ecological integrity, social and economic justice, and nonviolence, democracy, and peace. So these are all interconnected. It's this big systemic vision of sustainability. And our work at the Earth Charter Center for Education for Sustainable Development is to implement courses for educators and for young leaders who want to know more about this vision of sustainability and collaboration for a more just, sustainable, and peaceful world. And member states of UNESCO have recognized the importance of this document in education. So there have been 2 resolutions passed at the UNESCO General Assembly urging member states, so governments, their educators, to use this document in education for sustainable development. And as a member of the Secretariat, I can tell you what the work that we do here from our small office and that goes out into the world thanks to the great advances we've had in technology with video conferences and online course platforms. So that's what we're doing. And I manage the youth programs. So we have online courses. We have 2 for the different definitions of youth that we have around the world. And so once the young leaders take these courses, so we have this big group that comes in and takes a course 3 times a year, the course that we offer for youth ages 18 to 30. And then last year, we launched the new course for youth 15 to 18. So those youth who are still in high school. So once the ones who complete the course successfully and want to stay involved, we have a space for that in the Earth Charter movement. So then they become part of the Earth Charter Young Leaders Network. So as young leaders, we meet virtually and sometimes regionally, sometimes globally in person, but mostly virtually. We have this online community. And the young leaders are also part of this bigger Earth Charter movement, which involves organizations and educators around the world also working towards this bigger mission of sustainability and peace. So we have those 2 courses, Leadership, Sustainability, and Ethics, and Emerging Earth Leaders. They are online. They're not your regular massive online course because they're actually facilitated by myself and other young leaders who have already taken the course and want to come back and give back to the future generations of young leaders. And who are our participants? We have young people, a lot of educators, a lot of young educators who want to learn more about climate change, who want to learn more about sustainability, who maybe did not take ethics classes that related to the environment, and who want to learn more about well-being, planetary well-being. And they find our courses and they sign up. And we also have some educators around the world who have seen the value of these spaces that we're creating online, bringing young people together from different cultures, from different interests, from different backgrounds. And so there are some educators around the world who are also bringing their classes into these courses. And our challenge as a small education center is to make sure that we have this diversity in every cohort. So we have young leaders from China, from Malaysia, from Nigeria, from Kenya, from Costa Rica, from Argentina, Colombia, from the US, from Germany, the Netherlands. And it's really, every cohort is so different, but it's really such an amazing space, so incredible how we can have this human connection, even though we're all online in these little boxes as we are today. But we're still managing to do that, especially with the energy that young people bring to any space. So the topics that we cover in the courses are interconnected. So it's not that it's not like the Climate Reality Project where we learn about the science behind climate change. It's really this bigger perspective, this more systemic perspective of the motivation behind doing something about it. So so we talk about sustainability first in case the young people don't need a basis, so that we start off on the same basis. And this is where we talk about the Sustainable Development Goals, because not everyone knows about the SDGs. We also talk about eco-literacy, what we can learn from nature, what we can learn from each other. We talk about systems thinking and use these tools, leadership and ethics, of course. We take a couple of weeks to learn about the Earth Charter, since we have this document with these universal values, and the example of this participatory process. And we talk a lot about inner development as well. So if you have not seen the Inner Development Goals framework, I also recommend this as well for all of us as educators, as people working towards education and justice, because these inner development goals were developed by a group who wanted to help individuals also see, and organizations see, how they can contribute to these sustainable development goals. So in this course, we combine all of these into one package so that young leaders at the end of 10 weeks can feel ready to act at any level, so local, national, and global. And I just wanted to share about some of the tools and resources that we share in these courses. So we use systems diagrams, we use creative expressions, of course, the Earth Charter, the Earth Stories collection. I really recommend that if you have not seen it. We have learning communities, learning buddies, so that even though we're not in the same classroom in person, we can still connect with each other on a human base, and with that human connection, with that human intelligence that we have. Discussion forums every week. People can bring in their interpretation of the materials that we're reading, the videos that we're watching, and we have these participatory live sessions almost weekly spaces where we can connect at the same time. So yeah, so we use creative expressions. This Why Mosquitoes Buzz is an example of one of those stories, those traditional stories from the Earth Stories collection. So each of these stories that were found by this NGO, the Avalon Project, each of these stories is connected to an Earth Charter principle. So if you read the story, you can also see how it's connected to sustainability and other values. Our Earth Charter young leaders, they have access to all of our other resources that we have as an education center that I wanted to share. So we have master classes that they can join even after the course has ended, so we can continue with this lifelong learning opportunities. We have webinar discussions. We have an Earth Charter magazine that's new, that if you would like to check it out, it's on our website. On the homepage, you will find all of these resources. So the magazine, we would love contributions from educators, from youth working around SDG 4, specifically target 4.7, which is on education for sustainable development and global citizenship education. We have a podcast where our host, Miriam Vilela, our executive director, she has a deep dive on these topics and values with people around the world who have been working on sustainability for decades as well in education and these intersections. We invite our youth to come to our events as much as possible. And I wanted to mention today that we're hosting an Earth Charter education conference on reimagining education for ecological civilizations. It's a little less than 2 months from now. And this one will be in Winter Park, Florida, which is very close to Orlando, Florida, at Rawlings College. So if you're interested in learning more about this, you can go on the website. And yeah, so the Earth Charter Young Leaders, I'm sorry I'm rushing through. There's so much I want to say, but they are out there. So once they have taken the course, they remain engaged locally. As you see here, Victor in Nigeria doing trash cleanups. He is one of our most greatest influencers in the classroom because he's also an educator and he teaches his students about sustainability, the SDGs, inner development, the Earth Charter. We have Greshma in India who has gone back. She did a master's here at UPeace, and then she went back to India to her high school, and now she works bringing teens together in person, but also through a virtual teen cafe. We, young leaders, we're active at regional conferences of youth. So which come before the climate change conference of the parties, the COP. There's always a conference of youth before the COP, and before the conference of youth, there's a regional conference of youth, and before that, a local conference of youth. So we are active members there as much as we can. And in the last picture, you can see Anne Catherine. She's a young leader from Germany. So we also look for spaces or take advantage of spaces when we have a seat at the table. This is a meeting, a round table that young people were able to come together before the COP28 and talk to the youth representative from UAE. So I think I will leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. You can go to our website at earthcharter.org, and my name is Amanda Bennett. So if you want to get in direct contact with me, you can reach me at abennett@earthcharter.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for sharing your incredible work with us. Next, I am pleased to introduce Mark Engman, Pure Earth's Director of Policy and Advocacy. He is a strategic leader with significant experience in the U.S. government and in the nonprofit sector, working on global development issues. So Mark, over to you, and thank you so much for presenting today.
Great. Thank you so much. So on your screen, you should see a big set of eyes. Is that what you got? Okay. So I'm going to go through this super quickly. I know we need to get to Rose as well. I want to talk a little bit about lead poisoning and climate change. Sorry. What I want to do is just do a quick review of the scale of lead poisoning globally, how it affects children and their education, and then talk about how climate change and global responses to climate change can increase lead exposure. I'll skip that one. And then just a reminder of how this started. We all know lead poisoning is bad for kids, but we really didn't know how big it was globally. This report in 2020 researched the impact and scale of lead poisoning globally on kids. And what it found is that more than 800 million kids, 1 of 3 children globally, has some level of lead poisoning. So it was a really important resource. This slide has a lot of science on it, but why is lead so toxic? It's because, and I have to credit this slide to Dr. Howard Hu from the University of Southern California. Basically, in the body, lead mimics calcium. Okay, the flow of calcium ions between neurons is essential for brain development and function. So if that calcium is replaced with lead, that affects brain function. It also means that the potential for lead poisoning is worse in children with calcium poor or nutrition poor diets. Also, please note that if a pregnant mother has high blood levels, so does the unborn baby. So lead poisoning can actually start at birth. Just a few comments on how lead damages the brain. The most important point here is the one about the 765 million IQ points. This is from a report published in Lancet Planetary Health last fall that tried to estimate the loss of IQ because of lead poisoning. So globally, this is in children, 765 million IQ points lost, most of those in low and middle income countries. Now, that type of brain damage has a direct impact on learning potential. So this is a report from the Center for Global Development, also published last year, and it found that lead exposure costs kids up to 2 years of schooling. So there's a definite link between lead poisoning, brain damage, and learning potential. All right, now, what is the link between climate change and lead poisoning? So a couple of things to keep in mind. How do people get lead into their bodies in the first place? One, they ingest it, they eat it, or two, they breathe it. So that's one issue. The other thing to keep in mind is that there's a lot of lead out there already. It's already in the water, it's already in the soil, it's already in the air. The question is, how does it become available for people to either ingest or to breathe in? All right. So one issue is that warmer days mean higher blood lead levels. This is a chart from the CDC in the United States from several years ago, but it clearly shows the correlation between higher temperatures and cases of lead poisoning. So why does this happen? There's two reasons. One, higher temperatures and drier conditions cause more dust. It releases lead particles found in the dirt into the air and makes it more available for breathing in and causing lead exposure, lead poisoning. The other point is that higher water temperatures mean lead particles that might be in the soils and dirts underwater are more easily dissolved into the water and then ingested by people. So each 1 degree Celsius rise in water temperature boosts dissolved lead levels by 17%. Okay, so higher temperatures, more dust, more lead dissolved in water, more lead poisoning. Okay, we also know, and this was mentioned earlier, higher temperatures worsen natural disasters, fires, droughts, and floods. Those events also churn up soil and cause the release of lead from contaminated soil into the environment and make it more available for contamination and for lead poisoning. The other climate-related challenge I wanted to talk briefly about are these. These are used lead-acid batteries. Now, the point here is that as the world moves away from fossil fuels and towards a less carbon-intensive future, batteries are critical, okay? Lead-acid batteries are a big part of that change. There are billions of lead-acid batteries in the world. They're used in cars. We all know that. They're used in commercial energy storage. They're used for backup power supplies. And that market is not going away. That market is growing. Now, one good thing about lead is that it's highly recyclable. And in fact, the battery industry needs that recycled lead to produce new batteries. There's just not enough lead mined in the world to make all the batteries that they need. The problem is that much of that recycling is informal. If you recycle lead batteries correctly, it's a fairly safe process. If you don't, it's a very pollution-intensive process. And unfortunately, as much as half of lead-acid battery recycling in the world ends up in the informal sector. It looks like this. You get people, a lot of times kids, busting the batteries up and pouring the acid from the batteries out onto the ground. They take the lead plates out and melt them over open fires, which causes a huge amount of pollution. And then they pour the lead into these ingots, and these ingots get sold to generally middlemen and eventually back to the battery manufacturers to use in new batteries. It makes a huge mess, okay? It pollutes the soil, it pollutes the air, it pollutes the water in communities with these informal lead recycling facilities, and you see really high concentrations of lead poisoning in those communities. So clearly climate change and global responses to climate change that involve more batteries increase the risks of lead poisoning and increase the risks of affecting children's brains and learning potential. What it means for us is that as governments shift away from fossil fuels, they need to focus on these impacts on children, and that we really believe education systems need to include lead poisoning in their education strategies because it has such a direct impact on children's learning potential. Then finally, just to share with you, we don't have just time to watch it now, but Pure put a film together. It's called 1 in 36 million, about a child in Bangladesh. Unfortunately, Bangladesh is one of the most lead polluted countries in the world. 36 million kids with some form of lead poisoning. This is a story about one of them, and I encourage you to watch it because it really shows how lead impacts a child and a family. This particular family was living right next to one of these informal lead acid battery recycling facilities. So I will put all of these in the chat, all of these links, and I really thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that incredible presentation. I know we're running a little bit over time, but we have an incredible presentation coming up from Dr. Rose Cardarelli, if everyone is able to stay on for a few more minutes. Dr. Rose Cardarelli is the founder and CEO of the Education for All Coalition, an international NGO supporting refugee education worldwide. A former senior military commander, healthcare executive, and professor of human security, she is a recognized expert in strategy, global education, and sustainable development. Dr. Cardarelli serves as an NGO representative to the UN and the UNHCR, the Rotary International representative to UNICEF, and an SEL representative to UNESCO. Her recent work addressing climate trauma, social-emotional learning, and climate resilience is captured in her new book, The Climate Migration Crisis and Child Refugees, and it will be released by Emerald Publishing in March 2024. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Cardarelli. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and I will talk very quickly because I know we're over time. So if you're still here, I really appreciate that. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I'm delighted to speak to you for a few minutes about my research and recent book, Children and the Climate Migration Crisis, a casebook for global climate action and policy. I was compelled to write this book because I felt there was a need to understand the entire landscape as it applies to a displaced child's well-being. This book is dedicated to displaced children around the world and for their advocates, teachers, leaders, and policymakers who are striving to improve their circumstances and conditions. I'm grateful to my publisher, Emerald Publishing, for their incredible support and belief in this project that made it all possible. I'm also grateful to the many international organizations and colleagues who have provided their expertise and scholarly contributions, and to my team at the Education for All Coalition, particularly Holly Pomper, a graduate student at the University of Chicago, and Dana Marion, who's actually part of the GCE team and is here today, for spending long, excruciating hours working with me and for their dedication to making the world a better place for children. You are the best, and you make me feel very confident about the future. So thank you. The book first talks about the history and global agenda for climate migration. Then there are several chapters that present regional case studies to give the reader a better perspective about the causes and the results of displacement. Then we move into the topics of climate anxiety, trauma, resilience, education, and social-emotional learning. The final chapters identify the responsibilities of the international communities and governments to facilitate a real call to action, which I think is lacking. In this book, I focus on displaced children, their traumatic circumstances resulting in their displacement, and the overall implications of climate challenges as they apply to global stability and related insecurities. Climate resilience education provides an understanding of the environment, the implications of changing circumstances, and the necessary responses to remediate resulting problems. It is critical that we teach children how to think and prepare for climate change and disasters through personal adaptation and by reducing their vulnerabilities. We all realize climate migration causes hardships for families, disruptions in local, regional, and global stability, and has a negative impact on governance, economics, employment, education, social systems, and health. And unfortunately, climate events have had an even more dramatic impact on marginalized populations like refugee children in terms of their physical, mental, and emotional well-being. UNICEF's Children's Climate Risk Index indicates that nearly 1 billion youth, half of all children, are currently impacted by climate change. This is a real problem. With limited time, I want to share 2 key models we've developed that may help you in your work and action. This first model is the climate resilience model. This model helps to explain the multifaceted and continuous pattern of migration impacts through the lens of equity, adaptability, advocacy, resource distribution, resulting trauma, displacement, education responses, policy reformation, appropriate financing, and preparedness. This model is meant to be a tool for identifying the many interconnecting systems involved in climate and migration experiences, policies, and injustices. For policymakers and academics alike, the model can be a valuable tool for recognizing connecting issues and how global processes can shape global policies and individual lives. Next slide. The second slide is a model about the global policy framework, which recognizes interlinked forces and factors for change, including social justice, science, education, health, emergency management, financing, governance, and security and protection. Actions that prevent and mitigate climate change should stem from a framework of policies and resulting strategies that are based on sound international practice and national laws that address human rights and social protections while also focusing on adaptability and respect for local and host country customs. The global policy framework provides a strategic landscape for the international community, aid agencies, and governments to recognize a multitude of forces and factors that can influence change and facilitate a dignified, equitable, and safe climate migration. Leaders and policymakers have an inherent responsibility to lessen human suffering from the adverse impacts of climate migration. The goal at the forefront should be to develop climate resilience through actions that respond to climate risks and manage vulnerabilities to enable us to adapt to the Earth's changes. Climate change is a challenge that all people at all levels of government and all sectors of society have a vested stake. And while we can raise and champion these voices, in the end, that will not be enough. We must take action to create universal definitions, institute international laws, and implement policies that support unique local circumstances, culture, and language, and ensure our action is always grounded in human dignity and rights. So I'm going to leave you with some thoughts to ponder on what a call to action might entail. First of all, we need to define who is a climate refugee, because there are legal and protective implications. We need to develop a global action plan within national and international policy frameworks. We need to create a policy framework that addresses the needs of children and takes into account basic human rights. We need to conduct research and analysis that is cross-sectional at all levels of government. We need to plan for climate effects as it applies to infrastructure, loss of land, deterioration of physical and mental well-being, food and water insecurity, disruption of education, economic development, and livelihoods. We need to develop new national strategies and assist leaders, policymakers, and practitioners to prepare for climate events. And we need to generate support for the Conference of Parties, the COP. You just heard about COP28 in Dubai, to help developing countries to identify ways to adapt and gain access to funding. And finally, we need to maintain a sense of urgency for a tailored yet global system of resourcing grounded in science and reinforced by education. So in closing, our work will continue. We are actually going to the Earth Charter International Conference in April of 2024. We will be participating in the United Nations Civil Society Conference in May and the United Nations General Assembly Summit in the Summit of the Future in September. So that was quick, but it's been a privilege to be with you today, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rose, for your presentation and your insights. Because we're way over time and we want to be respectful of everyone's time as well, please send in your questions to the GCE email, and we'll make sure to get those to our speakers. And again, we want to extend a very big thank you to all of our wonderful speakers for their fantastic presentations during this coalition meeting. We encourage everyone to continue these vital conversations and advocate for global education. 3 reminders that we want to highlight. We have an upcoming coalition meeting in March on Monday, March 25th from 11 a.m. to 12:45 p.m. Eastern Time. This March coalition meeting will be focused on the issues with the new FAFSA rollouts and the challenges to accessing financial aid in the United States. A second highlight is for folks who want to participate in funding requests for fiscal year 25. We have a Google Doc that allows our coalition members to put in the requests for the fiscal year 25 funding request. And lastly, we also want to share with y'all our planning calendar for the year 2024 and a brainstorming Jamboard. So Please, if you have any exciting ideas or events that you want to share with us, please feel free to put them in the Jamboard. And as mentioned before at the opening of this coalition meeting, we want to continue to encourage everyone to reach out to members of Congress, urging support for the Reauthorization Act and full global education funding. And again, please let us know if you have any announcements to share for March, April, May, and any other upcoming opportunities. And please contact us at info@GCE-US.org with updates, speaker, and topic ideas. And we'll go ahead and share all that information in the chat right now. And please, again, for questions that audience members have for speakers, please feel free to send it to the info@GCE-US.org email so that we can give those to our speakers. Thank you again for your patience and your time, and really appreciate you being here in the space.